Nick Durant here with Tattoo University, and today I'm going to talk about springs. I've talked about machine tuning a lot, and I've talked about springs a lot, but today I'm going to focus specifically on springs and how to set them up. A lot of times when you're learning something, you might not catch on to something at first. It might take a little while for you to understand. And I know when I first started tattooing, I read a lot of books and things didn't make sense. And then once I've learned something, once I went back to those books a couple of years later and read them again, everything kind of made sense. If you don't get something at first, don't give up and don't get frustrated, because you might need to go through a couple of steps and see some more stuff and go through practice a little bit more before you totally understand. What you want to do is watch this video and go practice. Practice, practice, practice. Do as much as you can. Try to learn some new stuff, and then revisit this video if you're still having problems, and see if maybe the second time you watch it, it makes a little more sense. I'm going to show you this in a different way than I've shown before. I've shown this several different times, and I've talked about this during the machine tuning process, but today I'm going to try to give you some visuals and do things a little bit differently, just because maybe you're not catching on the way it's being explained or the way other people are explaining it. So I'm going to try to come up with a different way to explain it so that it'll make sense. And maybe you can have that aha moment where you go, okay, I finally get this. It finally makes sense. Something just clicks, and all of a sudden you get it. Sometimes you guys are your own worst enemy, because you'll listen to somebody and you'll just do something because they told you to do it, or everybody else is saying this, so you go jump on the bandwagon and you do it also. Just because somebody tells you to do something doesn't mean that it's going to work for you. And I always say when you watch my videos to go try it out. And if it doesn't work for you, then don't do it. But you will find that no matter what, you always learn something from these videos, and you'll form an opinion whether you like the way I do things or not. And that opinion will help you with your tattooing and help you move on and become your own tattoo artist and develop your own style. Don't just listen to Joe Blow when he tells you that you need a certain spring set up on your machine if you want it to be a shader, color packer, or a liner. You always want to look at the machine first and the numbers that work for you as a tattoo artist. Do not come in with this preconceived notion of the springs you need to run a machine. We have common names for the tattoo machines that we use, and they are liner, shader, color packer. Those are the terms that we use in the industry for the different types of machines we have. Now, this isn't necessarily true, because sometimes you have a liner that you can shade with because it's actually a shader that you're lining with. Sometimes you have a shader that you can pack color with. If you turn up the volts, have it hit a little bit harder, turn the volts down, you can start shading with it. You have certain machines that can do all of these, especially now with rotary machines. So just so you know, we use these terms, but they're not always correct, because sometimes you can do more than just one thing with one machine setup. What I used to hear all the time is that for a liner, you should use 20 or 18 gauge springs on the front and a 18 gauge spring on the back, And a shader, you should use a 20 or 22 gauge spring on the front with whatever spring on the back, and then a color packer, you should use either a 16 or 18 spring on the front. I hear this all the time and I see this all the time, and it's totally wrong. You know, I see where it's coming from, but you need to understand tattoo machine and spring theory. What you need to understand with tattooing is that these preconceived numbers that people give you never work. People always ask, what voltage should I use? What spring should I use? What tension should I use? It all depends on how you are tattooing. You need to learn the theory behind it so that you can understand how to adjust correctly. All this preconceived stuff, you might get lucky and you might get a machine that kind of works the way it's supposed to. This is what you want to do with these numbers. Forget all about them. And don't listen to people when they say you need to have this or you need to have that. Learn the spring theory. Learn how to tune your machine. And these numbers will change. You can start with these numbers. These could be a recommendation. This could be a starting point or a jump off point. You could start with these springs. But don't think that every single shader needs to have a 20 gauge spring or a 22 gauge spring on the front. Get rid of these notions that you need to have these springs on your machines. You want to set up your machine and then see what spring gets you the correct numbers that you want. Don't start with your springs first. Springs come afterwards. Springs are an afterthought. So you guys are going in thinking right off the bat, I'm just going to throw these springs on here. Get rid of that notion. You want to learn first what numbers work for you for your machines, and use that first, and then use the springs to get the correct numbers. These are our machines broken down again. You want to think about what it takes to get these three machines and what adjustments make these three machines unique. The speed, duty, and the throw of these machines will adjust the marks you get while you're tattooing and how these machines tattoo. Your numbers might be different than mine. I'm just going to show you my numbers here and how I set up my machines. With a liner, you want a faster machine. With a shader, you can have fast or medium speed. And then with a color packer, you want a slow machine. A liner, you are going to do a line, you're going to be moving your hands. You want to make sure you get a solid line, so you run it a little bit faster with a shorter stroke. So a liner has a faster speed, a shorter stroke, and I run all of my machines at 50 to 55 on my duty. But I run my liners faster with a shorter stroke. My shaders, I run them about medium speed with a medium stroke. And then my color packer, I run them at slower speeds with a longer stroke. And this is where you guys are getting mistakes. I see this a lot. your machines are not set up correctly. All of these things need to be set up to get the correct marks. If you are trying to color pack with a machine that's set up like a shader, you will get weak color. It won't be saturated. Now you can line with a shader, but if you are moving your hand speed too fast, then you will get weak lines. If the ink you are using is thicker ink, you can line with the shader. But if it's thinner ink, you're going to have problems because it's not going to work. You need to go back to your liner setup. So the way your machine is set up will affect the way your tattoo looks. We're talking about machine tuning here because we're talking about springs. Springs are vital when it comes to tuning your machine. There are several things you need to have your machine tuned, and this is why it's difficult for people, because all of these things are little details. When added up, give you the total package, give you a machine that is working correctly. If any of these are off or incorrect, you do not have a tuned machine. If a machine is kind of tuned, it is not tuned. You do not have a kind of tuned machine. All of these things need to be correct. The machine setup, all the parts need to be in the right place and working correctly, and the correct parts. Stroke. The stroke length needs to work correctly so that your ink will work correctly and the speed of the machine will be correct. Your tension will affect whether you're going to pack ink or barely put ink in. If you are color packing, you want the ink to go in. If you are shading, you want to work at it a little bit so it doesn't go in solid all the time. You can build it up. Tension is involved with that. Your hit. If you don't have enough hit, the pigment will not go where it needs to go. You will get a ghost image. You will not tattoo. And if you have too much hit, you will hurt somebody and scar somebody up. Springs are involved in all of these things to show you how important the spring setup is. The right springs so that your machine works, and the right length so that everything is in the correct spot. Stroke. The way your spring bends and the thickness of your spring, the length of your spring, will determine how long your armature bar travels and the stroke of the machine. Tension. That's your rear spring, and how much upward tension is on that rear spring. How difficult is it for the coil? How much tension does it take for that coil to pull down that rear spring? Here's the rear spring, here's your coil. It's going to pull down, and that also affects your hit. So you have really weak springs, you're going to get a really weak hit. You have too much tension, your machine's going to heat up and it's going to burn out on you, and it's not going to work correctly. So there's a balance here. Everything needs to be balanced. Here is your spring, and you have different dimensions for your spring. You have the length of your spring, which is how long it is from here, from the bottom to the tip, from the back to the front. That's your length. And then you also have how wide your spring is from here to here, your width. You have your length and your width. And you also have, this is the one that some of you have a little harder time understanding, you also have the thickness of the spring. That's if you turn the spring this direction sideways and look at it, how thick your spring is. Typically, the most used springs are 18 gauge springs. And that is telling you the thickness of the spring. And you can set up any machine with just 18 gauge springs. For the most part, if you have 18 gauge springs, you can set up any machine. 18 gauge is telling you how thick this spring is. And what we typically use is either 18 gauge, 20 gauge, and even 22 gauge. Now, this is thinner, and as the numbers go up, it gets thicker. These are bigger. This isn't like needles where the higher up you go, the smaller it gets. The bigger the number, the thicker the spring. Now, just because this is what we typically use, that doesn't mean you can't use a 19 gauge spring or a 21 gauge spring or even a 17 to 16 gauge spring. If you have the need to use a spring this size, you should use it. But the problem is, if you start going too far on either end of the spectrum, if you start getting really crazy thick or really crazy thin springs, then it just doesn't work correctly. So these are the typical numbers for your springs. I'm going to give you some visuals here to help you understand springs and how they work on your machine. Here is a diving board with the little adjustment here, and here is a swimming pool right here. Typically the diving board has this fulcrum, this point right here, that you can adjust your diving board. You can either move it back or move it forward. If you move it back, that makes your diving board shorter and it makes the diving board really stiff. If you go over to Grandma's house, this is you right here, and you want to go swimming, and you get on there and you want to make the biggest, baddest cannonball you can. So you really want to get up there and get some air on this thing. So you would crank this all the way back and give yourself as much board as you can, because when you jump on this board right here, the board will go down and then it will swing back up, pole vaulting you over here where you can do your cannonball into the pool. When you put this fulcrum point all the way back, you get a really springy diving board, and it travels a lot. You can see sometimes the diving board almost touches the water and then shoots you up in the air like that. You know, so you cannonball, you make a big old splash, and you have all kinds of fun. So let's do another scenario here. And this time you went to Grandma's house and somebody moved this as far back as it could go. And this board is now really stiff. And you come running out of the house to the pool, and you want to do a cannonball, here you are, and you jump really hard onto the end of this board. So you jump as high as you can and you hit this board. Instead of pole vaulting yourself over here to the pool where you can do a cannonball, you hit the end of this and you break an ankle and then you fall into the pool because this is really stiff now. And then you drown because you broke your ankle. End of story, you know, grandma sad, crying, you were too young to go. And the reason for that is because this board is now really stiff. And you need to think about that when you are dealing with your springs. Here is our diving board again. Here's our fulcrum point. But this time, instead of grandma's pool, think about your duty cycle and that magic number that you're shooting for. 50 to 55%. Your duty cycle tells you how long your spring is in contact with your contact screw and how far away from it is. So if you get a 50% duty cycle, your machine is running evenly, it is running smooth. So how does a diving board at grandma's house relate to tattooing? Let's add a contact screw just magically floating in space here for this diving board. When you have a really long, flexible diving board, you get a lot of flex. This goes up and down. So you bounce on this diving board, it goes down here, and then comes back up. And this time it's going to hit this magically floating contact screw here. Here's the fulcrum point, but this spring will bend like this once it touches a contact screw. And that'll give it more stroke. That will travel further this direction. So your needles will travel further. And your spring will stay in contact with your contact screw a lot longer. That will adjust your duty cycle. If we choke up on this and put a shorter spring on here, we're going to cut off half of this board. We have a shorter spring, and this bends. It will not travel as far this direction, and if it is really stiff, once it hits this contact screw, we don't have as much travel. It's not going to bend, it's not going to flex, it's going to stay straight. And as soon as it touches this, it's going to go back down. So as soon as it touches this, it's going to go back down immediately. So your stroke length, it didn't go as far, so it didn't go as far up, and it immediately went down, giving you a nice short stroke length. And this would be perfect. Let's turn this into a spring. Little short fatty spring for a liner. This is why you have different lengths in your springs and different widths. And this is a nice fat spring. So it's really stiff. That thing's got no give. It's going to hit that and immediately go back down. But your front spring will affect your speed more, and your rear spring will affect your tension and your duty cycle. Here is our spring stock. This is what we're going to cut our spring out of. And we come in here, and you don't need all of this up here because you just need an area big enough for your contact screw to sit on right here. So we take this off, and we take this off, and we make a little notch back here so that we can attach it to our armature bar. Round off those corners because you don't want any sharp edges, and there you go. You have a nice little fatty spring that will give you a nice fast running machine. We take that same spring stock, but this time let's cut it a little bit longer. This time we don't want it to be as fat. We still need to attach it to our machine. We still need our little area for the contact screw, but instead of cutting it up here, we're going to start back. We're just going to leave this area flat because it needs to be big enough for our washer right here. As soon as we get past our washer, we want to start to taper off. So we get up here and we get a really long, flexible spring. And you get a different shaped spring that is more flexible. That is one way of getting two different kinds of, that is one way of adjusting your springs. You have more material, it's going to be stiffer. You have less material, more flex, it's going to bend more. Now, let's adjust this even more. Here you start off with a 18 gauge spring. And here you have an 18 gauge spring. This one's still more flexible because it's longer and it has more flex. This is fatter. But let's up this and make this 20 gauge spring. You just adjusted the thickness. It was this thick, but now you made this even thicker. This whole area here, this is a really thick spring. That spring just went from being really flexible to being stiffer. So that's one way we can adjust our springs. That's another way. It's thicker. The more material you have on here, the stiffer it's going to be. The less material you have, the more it's going to flex. But I'm not only talking about the thickness, I'm also talking about the length and the width. Again, adjusting all of these will adjust how your spring works. Let's look at your rear spring. Same stock, one a little bit shorter, one a little bit longer. This time you need to connect to your rear deck, and you also need to connect to your armature bar and your front spring. So what you end up with is something that looks a little bit like this. A shorter spring will be stiffer and won't have as much flex. You will have more tension. A longer spring has more flex. You get less. The thicker your rear spring, is, the more tension you have. The longer it is, the less tension you have. This affects how stiff your spring is, how much pull it's going to take for those coils to pull your springs down, to pull that armature bar down. So here is the tricky part to this. You can't just slap any length springs on your machine. Just because you need less tension, you can't just throw a longer spring on there. The springs need to be the correct length. So here is your contact screw, your armature bar, the rear deck. And then here is your vise. Do this correctly. Here is your vise and your tube. Your tube needs to be lined up with your nipple so the needle goes straight down the tube. This is when I'm talking about setup, how your springs need to be correct or else your machine is not set up properly. Your needle needs to go right here. So your spring length, your springs also connect to the rear deck here. So your spring length, your rear spring needs to attach to the armature bar. So your rear spring needs to go from here to here. And then your front spring needs to go to the tip of your contact screw from here to here. So that is the length of the spring you need. If your contact screw comes out here right above your armature bar nipple, then your front spring needs to come out here. So this is the required length for your springs. This is why we have thinner and thicker springs. If you have a really thin spring out here, it might not work. So here is the distance from this contact screw to the end of the rear spring. And actually you have a washer here on top of your spring, so technically it's really right here. Because your spring doesn't start bending till it hits the end of this rear deck. The longer this is, the more bendy this is going to be. This is like a ruler. I want you guys all to get a metal ruler and just wiggle it around, bend it. If you grab it way back here, you get a lot of bend. Goes from here to here. If you grab it up here, there's not a lot of bend. It doesn't bend as much. This might sound like I'm repeating information or beating you over the head with this information, but this is how it works. This is what makes sense when it comes to springs. This is how you will learn. You need to think about the bend in these springs and how much tension is on these springs. Go to this contact screw. That's less distance. That's less bend. That's a faster machine. Out here, longer, that's your color packers. That's your slower machines. That's your bendy springs. Back here, even if you come back even further, right here, these are your faster machines. These are your liners. Here's your color packers, your shaders, and your liners. Depends on the length of the spring. This is why you have really long frames for your color packers, and then a medium frame and a shorter frame for your shaders and your liners. The length matters. Size does matter. What if this rear spring has too much flex and we're not getting the correct duty cycle. We go thicker. And then we try that one out. If we went too thick and we went too high, then we switch that out and we try a different one. Here's the trick. And once you get used to machines, it's hard to find the right adjustment, the right setting right off the bat. But you just try some springs that you think will work. Let's go back to the beginning, what I told you not to do. Someone told you to set up a shader with a 20 gauge front spring and an 18 gauge rear spring. So, why not? Let's give it a try. Let's do it. But for the machine frame you're using, something's not quite right. Your speed might be too high, or your length back here is too much, so you don't have enough tension. So let's adjust again. Let's take this 18. So we started off with what somebody told us. Didn't quite work. So let's change that to a 20 and see if that works. Now our tension is correct, but now our stroke is off, or our speed is too high. So that didn't quite work. Let's go with an 18 on the front. Speed is also directly related to the weight of your armature bar. So don't think it's all the spring. It's your armature bar as well, but change your armature bar out, change your springs out. You just keep adjusting until you get the correct numbers and the correct stroke. This is what you want to look at, your numbers. Your numbers and your stroke. And you adjust, you keep adjusting back and forth. Maybe that didn't work, but you were really close. So let's throw a 19 on the back. And a 18 on the front. And that dials you in, that gets your numbers right where you want them. You have to know what you're doing, know the adjustments, know what direction to go. How do you know you need to go thicker? And how do you know you need to go thinner? Do you want it stiffer or do you want more flex? Your numbers will tell you that. So here is where the fun begins. Now it is time to tune a tattoo machine. And I always tune them when they're loaded. Loaded meaning they have a needle and a tube on there with some rubber bands, because if you tune it without it, it'll be different when you run it. And you can always just tune it higher and then adjust it when it is loaded, but this way you get a good idea of where the machine is running. Now, I think a lot of you are not understanding this because you don't have a power source with a readout. This wasn't the most expensive power source. It was around 50 to 60 bucks. But this has lasted me several years, and it has helped me tune a lot of machines because it tells me the voltage, the duty cycle, and the speed of the machine. If you are trying to tune machines, this will be a lifesaver for you. It will save you a lot of time. If you are just running machines that are already tuned, you can go without the display, but you're going off of sound and the feel of the machine. This way you have numbers, and the numbers are there to let you know everything is running correctly. Spend a little bit more money and get a power source that tells you the voltage, the duty, and the speed of your machine. Now, a lot of people ask me about this power source, and I could tell you, oh, this thing's lasted me for years, these are wonderful, go out and buy these. But you can buy the same power source and it could break on you. It could be a piece of crap. You always want to buy from a supplier that will refund your money, because this particular power source, this one exactly right here, has lasted me for years and it's been reliable. But that doesn't mean you don't go out and buy the same power supply and it's a piece of crap and it breaks. So always buy from somebody that'll return your money if you get a broken piece of equipment. But for me personally, this power supply has worked for a really long time, and I use it all the time for my machine tuning. This machine right now is set up as a color packer. The distance from my rear spring to the armature bar nipple and this front spring is that far. It's a good distance, so I get a pretty good throw on this. Let me show you the numbers. Oh, so this thing does need to be tuned. Okay, so I need to retune this. It's not working the best. Sounded like we're having a bit of a tuning issue here. Let me just check the tension on these rubber bands. Check my connection here and we'll try it again. So what I'm going to do is look at my numbers to make sure that this is working correctly. So right off the bat, I can tell this is moving around my front post, so I need to tighten that up. So that's my issue, is my front post has moved. But let me show you what I am looking at. And this is how you will know how to adjust your springs. I'm hoping everybody can see this. See if I can make it more clear. Right here is my duty cycle. Okay, so I'm going to tighten up my front post, keep that thing from moving around. Then I'm going to check my duty cycle. So right there we have 54% duty cycle, 55, so between 50 and 55. I also have 90 cycles per second. I told you this is a color packer, so it's running slower. It's at 55% duty cycle, and it's got a really long stroke. If you look at your gaps, you'll have wider gaps. That lets you know there's a longer stroke there. And see how I have a really flexible front spring? That allows my needle to travel further. See that flex in that? That is a prime example of flex for your front spring. This machine is set up correctly for packing color because my speed is correct, my duty is correct, and my stroke is correct. But how did I get there? So we start off with this. How do we know what to do with these? Probably going to do another video on this because I actually want to show you setting these springs up on the machine and how that changes the numbers. But this video is already kind of long, so I'm just going to point out some things and bring this video to a conclusion. You can see I have a lot of springs here, a lot of things to choose from, but this top row are springs that I've just kind of played around with. Some one-piece springs that I made. They're kind of jacked up, so I just threw them out of the pile. Some of these are weirdly shaped. They weren't cut correctly. I've actually soldered these front springs together to make it one thicker front spring. I've been messing around with that a little bit. That one doesn't belong up there. And I've been messing with the shapes and the thickness of the springs. So we don't want to use those, so those are out of the picture. Now, you should have an assortment of springs, different sizes and lengths. A spring like this can be used for a liner, a shorter, fatter spring, or you can go with a thinner spring that's a little bit longer. These are both 18 gauge, but this one right here is 16 gauge. So you get more flex. Those are my front springs. And then I have some rear springs. These are 3/4 inch width. That would give you more tension than this one right here, which is a 1/2 inch width. They're both 18 gauge, but this one, the width of this one is not as wide as this one here. Some of these rear springs are really short and others are longer. So this spring is thinner than this one. It's a 1/2 inch spring, but this is a 23 gauge spring. This one's only 18. So I have options here to choose from when I'm adjusting my machines. And that's important because you have to find the right combination for the machine.